Good afternoon from London. I'm Ehsan Masood. I'm a science writer, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Pervez HOODBHOY, who's a physicist from Islamabad. We're here at UCL, at University College London, and we are talking about Professor HOODBHOY's latest book, which is
Pakistan, Origins, Identity and Future. So this is a book that seeks to cover a very broad range of history, beginning from thousands of years ago, moving towards the era of the Muslim conquests of the subcontinent, then towards the movements that eventually led to partition, and then beyond partition to the present, and then speculations about the future.
So we're going to talk a little bit about your book, but I'd also like us to be a bit more broader and talk about your other books, which you've written. You've written books about science, you've written books about science popularization, you've written books about history of science, and then of course I'd also like to get a little bit into your research interests and some of the academic work that you have been doing. But let's begin with your latest book. What prompted you to write it? It's not as if though there's a shortage of books in this area. Why Pervez HOODBHOY? Why do we have to hear Professor HOODBHOY's take on Pakistan's origins and its future?
Two reasons. One is that no book has been written which comprehensively covers Pakistan's past, way back into thousands of years to the present.
And when you say when you say thousands, what's the origin point?
So one wants to look at how people who lived on this subcontinent wish to how they identified themselves. That's a very important political question at the time, because in India a huge transformation has taken place with the Hindutva coming into power, which says that this was a land that was Hindu, where the people who lived on that subcontinent identified with a single faith, and it was a glorious past, and it's a past that was interrupted by the invasion of first the Muslims and then by the British, and had they not come, we would have been flying in the sky.
And so what are you telling your readers?
That's complete rubbish. It is not true. It is just as untrue as Muslims believing that their past was unsullied and that they were absolutely the greatest civilization that has ever lived and created all the knowledge that there was. So you see, the point is that every civilization, and I don't say just Hindu civilization or Muslim civilization, every civilization wants to show itself as absolutely the greatest.
Of course, of course I do. So
furthermore,
I just want to interrupt you for a sec. So what is the origin point? When you say thousands of years, so which epoch or which period are we talking about?
It's very hard to say because there is so little documentation of what happened in the far past. By the far past, I mean something like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, because they're just artifacts that are left over from that time. There's no documentation. There's almost nothing that has survived the passage of time. And so the historians of ancient India, whose research I build upon, and this is just for one chapter, as a prelude to Pakistan, well, even they are very confused about where history actually started, and especially when it comes to the history of ideas, history of science. So when you ask me a specific question about dates as far back as that, I'm as confused as the best historians are.
I mean, there is, of course, in terms of documentation, there's the story of the Bakhshali manuscript, the mathematical treatise, which was discovered not far from Peshawar, and which there is a fragment in the Bodleian Library. Is that a period that you look at, which is, of course, was the Buddhist?
Well, that's a matter of detail. That I would not get into, because that goes into a very particular kind of history. But more important for today is the identification of of Indians with a Hindu scheme of things, with a religion. Whereas in fact...
And similarly in Pakistan, where is it true that the history that's taught, or to what extent, I'll rephrase that, to what extent is Pakistan's own history, does that acknowledge the 1,000 years that you go into in your book?
No.
At what point does education begin? So
this is precisely the point, that our history in Pakistan, as taught to children, begins in the year 712 AD, 712 AD. Young conqueror Muhammad bin Qasim, who was sent to, we here, sent to spread Islam, but he was there like any other conqueror to, well, get the riches of the land, plunder, and take them back with him. And so that's exactly what happened. Now, if one looks at the history of Islam in India, it's very diverse. It's the Hindus today, they accuse Muslims as being plunderers, of desecrating their temples, of looting the riches and taking them back, and destroying and actually committing genocide also. But this is only a very small part of the whole truth. The fact is that a lot of Muslims stayed, and in fact the Mughal Empire was the longest lasting empire which had actually taken most of India under its control. It created beautiful architectural buildings, works, poetry, music, and an organization that allowed a high level of culture to prosper for something like 350 to 400 years. Okay, but that is now being denigrated in the official Indian culture, in the official Indian.
But is it not also true that empires, they're not necessarily benign or benevolent when there may be an aspect of them that's benign in terms of how they govern and how they rule. They often need to rule by consent, otherwise things get complicated. But in order to take power, I can't imagine the sort of, the Mughals came and showered Smarties on people and said, hey, we're your new rulers now, we love you. I mean, it must have been a bit violent, surely.
Of course it was. All empires ruling by force is obviously begets violence. But the question is, what do people get in return? So look at the Mongols. They conquered and they slaughtered and they gave very little back. It's not until they were absorbed into the larger Muslim culture that they became part of a bigger Islamic empire. In terms of India, well, certainly the Mughals, as you say, didn't come to shower cookies or whatever. What did you say?
Smarties.
Smarties, yes.
Your British audience will know what that is.
Okay. But they did contribute a lot to Indian culture. The most beautiful architecture, the music, the poetry, I'd say the finest, most exquisite gardens were created by the Mughals, and they exist even today. And to remove all that from history is just not fair. All empires have had their bad sides and some good sides.
So is that, just to stay with the point just briefly, is that a little bit like saying that the British Empire created railways and it gave us parliamentary democracy and it gave us a language that you and I are talking in, and it was therefore a civilizing influence, full stop? Is that how, would you make the same comparison?
I would not deny that. I would not deny the fact that when the British came, they connived with local rulers, they displaced them, they came as traders, but eventually they ruled over all of India, and they did it very cleverly. They eventually used force, and force in substantial amount, and there are massacres that they carried out, for all of which they ought to be condemned for. I condemn them for that. And of course, they took away treasures from India, raw materials. They made India a market for their finished goods. And this is how
So
British capitalism then spread.
So are there any parallels in the behavior of imperialists between the Mughals and the British?
But wait,
I mean,
you asked me whether we owe something to the British. I say yes. Would we have had science and modern learning? No, I don't think so. Not for a very long time. Let's look at the fact that Muslim civilization had pretty much ground to a stop in terms of new ideas, in terms of creating new knowledge. Yeah, from the 9th to the 13th century they were great, but within India, but that was back in Arabia and in Iran. But on Indian soil, the Muslims didn't create anything of intellectual value, of science in particular. As far as Hindu civilization goes, well, even before the Muslim conquerors had come, you don't find anything new being produced over there. Yeah, long before that, yes, you do, and there were pockets here and there, but it was European civilization. It was the force of the Enlightenment, which then has brought India to where it is and Pakistan to where it is.
So one of the arguments that's raised amongst historians, which is that when it comes to colonialism and indigenous knowledge or local knowledge, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries were not colonized fully, or they were partially colonized, whereas India had a very long stretch, a relatively long stretch, from before the War of Independence, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, and then for a good sort of couple of 100 years either side, 100 years either side. So within that, there was a very clear policy of replacing whatever was done in vernacular languages with English, with European languages, and there was a sort of pretty clear policy of who will be educated and who won't be educated. What do you think that did to just people's ability to think for themselves in their own language, leaving aside all the religious aspects, but just the ability to actually learn, because you're suddenly having to not only change the way you learn, but you have to find a new language to do it in, and so on.
Okay, so let's look at the Muslim.
So away from advanced science, but just, in terms of just learning.
Absolutely, and advanced science can't be actually separated from that. In terms of indigenous languages, well, Arabic was not indigenous to the Indian subcontinent. The learning that existed in Muslim culture was primarily in Arabic and in Persian.
In India?
No, everywhere. Everywhere. However, what was spoken in India was vernacular languages. The elite did learn Arabic and Persian. In fact, Persian was the language of the courts. But modern thought, the Enlightenment thought and the scientific revolution that came after it was all in English. It was very little in Urdu, and in fact the difficulty of translation became evident when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1860 something started the Translation Society of Scientific Works into Urdu, and it didn't get all that far. To this day, there is not one good book that I can find on modern physics or mathematics of a reasonably high level that's in Urdu. Well, look, I do my distance learning lectures in Urdu, so I know the language well enough, and I'm able to explain in the language well enough. But if I ask for where is the written material for that, I don't find one single good textbook in Urdu in either mathematics, let's say class 10, or physics class 10, or biology class 10, because somehow there was not enough interest in that to reactivate the language and make it alive. I can say the same thing about Hindi. And yet, you see, there's a huge difference between India and Pakistan today in terms of scientific accomplishment. And so it's not just a question of language alone. It's a question of how much that thought is absorbed into a culture.
And I mean, just sort of going a little bit further into the present, so 1947 is the end of, was the partition of India, officially, if you like, the end of empire. At what point, or at that point, do you think that the Pakistani state then, in a sense, retook control of, well, it had control of education policy away from the previous rulers? Do you think at that point, what happened in terms of education policy?
That's a good question. I think that in the first few years, in fact, until Bhutto, who took over in 1971, 72, we were pretty much gliding along. And so what that meant is that the kind of education that the British had left in India, in Pakistan, was what was being taught in schools. And the hope was to make...
Except most people weren't in schools, were they?
Except most people weren't in school, and the idea was to make this broader base, and the government wasn't particularly committed to that. For one thing, it didn't have the resources. For another, because the government was made up of landlords initially, and still is today actually, big feudals who didn't want their populace educated because they thought that education was something subversive and dangerous. And in fact, there was active opposition to the spread of education. So anyway, the kind of education was pretty much what was there pre-1947. Then comes along Bhutto. And Bhutto makes this difference. He says he's going to nationalize the schools.
So he's like the first elected prime minister. Is that right?
We had many prime ministers.
But as in he came through a full election, and then he...
If you're talking of a genuine election, yeah, he was the first genuine elected prime minister of Pakistan. What happens in 1977 with his being deposed and Ziaul Haq coming along is an attempt to redefine Pakistan. No longer is it to be a Muslim state. It is now to be an Islamic state run by Sharia, and so education must be, its direction must be turned around.
But, can I ask, how did they do that? Because they didn't change the constitution. So how was it possible to redefine the state if the constitution was the same, the 1973 constitution?
You can make, there are plenty of amendments to the constitution, and the introduction of laws which were draconian. So that's easy enough, but it was an express directive from General Ziaul Haq. This was to the Universities Grant Commission, and this was to Islamicize all of education, including science. And so you had absolute absurdities coming into the teaching of science itself.
What were you doing at that time? Were you a lecturer? Had you started your teaching, or were you a student?
Actually, I was more senior than that. I joined Islamabad University in 1973, and 1979 I was an assistant professor, and during Ziaul Haq's years I was an assistant professor, and then later became associate, so forth.
So in that 6-year window, you saw quite a big transformation.
Huge. 11 years of Ziaul Haq
which was a military dictatorship.
Which was a military dictatorship. It was transformative. It changed the entire landscape. So you had punishments, public hangings, public floggings. You had...
Which you didn't have before.
Which you did not have before. He introduced that. In order to get a job in a physics department or any department in a university, you had to know parts of the Quran. You would be asked about the ideology of Pakistan, and or perhaps you would be asked, and a favorite question was, give the names of the wives of the Holy Prophet. And if you didn't know them, well, you didn't stand a chance of being selected.
So how did that affect your, can you give an example of how that affected your working life? You know, you come into work one day, you have to teach a class of 60 or 30 or 100 students. You know, if you compare the 1973 period to the later period, is there an example of how it changed your life?
The ambience in the university changed, whereas young women used to come just as girls are normally dressed. Well, now they had to cover up. Now so the hijab, the burqa, that was enforced. You had prayers within the departments, and not just in the university mosque, but in the departments themselves.
Compulsory prayers where you had to go?
So there arose a complication, because Shias will never pray behind Sunnis, and Sunnis of one kind will not pray behind Sunnis of the other kind. And so although the head of department was mandated, every male head of department was mandated to lead the prayers, so it became pretty embarrassing, because he could be a Shia, and you don't want to pray behind a Shia.
So the university policy was that if you're a department head, you become an imam, basically?
Yeah.
More or less?
Yeah, yeah.
This is under the General Zia period?
This is under General Zia. And so even within Zia's time, this policy faltered out. But I have to tell you that there were...
Did you have to change what you wore? Did you have to change your clothing?
The ones who wanted to curry favor did. So you would...
And what did they wear? How did they change their clothing?
Before Zia-ul Haq, they wore what you and I wear today. After Zia-ul Haq, the ones who wanted to be in the good eye, in the favor of the authorities, they would wear shalwar kameez, or they'd wear maybe a turban, some of them. All that happened. So, and as far as the women go, the women teachers as well, they then would go for hijab. So there were ways of signaling that you were with the powers that be or opposed to the powers that be. And this was true across the board in every part of Pakistani life. So,
you know, there have been periods of restoration of democracy. There was a movement for the restoration of democracy, the MRD. Did things revert at that point, in between the military periods and the democratic periods?
Well, to an extent, but I think that the changes that Zia-ul Haq made were essentially irreversible. So amongst them was the way in which the teaching of history was distorted, and the amount of Islam that was inserted into the educational curriculum was then continued on by the rulers who came later. The need to have Pakistan portrayed as a security state, that need remained, because the army has essentially been in control of Pakistan, not just since the time of Bhutto or Zia-ul Haq or Musharraf. It's been in control all throughout, and we need to see India as a perpetual enemy. Because if you don't have India as a perpetual enemy, what is going to justify such a huge army? What's going to justify its hold on natural resources, on every form of business in Pakistan? And so that's a necessity.
I mean, you mentioned the army. The army is also a big employer of academics. And in the period that you've been present, they've increased their presence in colleges, in universities. They have, pretty much a very large budget. How does that affect the teaching and the research environment in science?
The army is not a big employer in terms of academics, no way. Yeah, there is the National Defense University, there is the National University of Science and Technology, which is run by the army.
ComSats?
ComSats, no. ComSats is not run by the army. There are a few
Well,
places.
and the Atomic Energy Commission's vast empire, if I can call it that.
Yes, but that's not run by the army.
But it's funded by the army, isn't it?
It's a security establishment, not the army. We have to make the fine distinctions there.
Fine distinctions are important?
Yes.
What is the security establishment?
It's broader than that. So the security establishment would include not just the army, but it would include the other two services, the Navy and the Air Force. It would include the ISI.
And there's a Air Force university as well now, isn't there?
Oh, there are lots of
And there's naval universities.
The universities everywhere now. 300 of them, you can't even count them anymore. They used to be just 30 in 1970 or so. Now there are 300. It may not be right to call them universities, though, with the kind of education there is.
We'll come to that. So, but just coming back to the security establishment and its role in the academy, in the scholarly world. I mean, I think, if you asked your average person on the street, some people will probably say, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here now, that, you get good quality education for a relatively low fee. You get something that's recognized, things that employers like, because they think that it's better than what you might get in other establishments. Is that something that you hear?
First of all, I don't believe the establishment's involvement in educational institutions is very large. Yeah, there is the Bahria University, there's the Air University. Both of these are next to each other in Islamabad. There's the National University of Science and Technology. There's PIAS, Pakistan Institute for Engineering and Applied Sciences. Yeah, I guess there are half a dozen such places. But that's not very much. And besides, the quality of education there, marginally different from the rest. The real problem is no university in Pakistan has faculty that deserves to be called faculty at that level.
Which is a big criticism of yours. You've written about it extensively. You continue to write about it. What would you say are your three biggest concerns about the quality of faculty?
It's very simple. Ask them to explain the basics of their subject, and most of them will falter. Ask them to take an exam at the level of the GRE, which is necessary for entrance into a US university. Entrance, mind you. And I suspect no more than 10% might make it. I don't have firm figures. If you look at publications, it really does not make any sense, because so much of it is plagiarized, so much of it is fake data, so much of it is simply meaningless. Now, graduate students, they churn out 20 publications during their entire PhD research, so that has completely lost meaning. And so, basically, it's, do the faculty have enthusiasm for the subject? Do they want to learn that subject? I'm sure they could. I'm sure every human being.
And presumably many want to.
Not many want to. I'll tell you why they don't want to. That they're not pushed into that, because you get the same pay. And nobody will know the difference whether you've learned your math or not.
Okay. So Professor HOODBHOY, in the span of time that you've been a professor teaching physics, at all levels, both undergraduate all the way to doctoral level, what has changed from the kind of student you had in the 1970s to what you have now?
So as I said, in the 1970s, I joined a department that was good. Good by UK standards, good by American standards.
And you were in a relatively young university. It wasn't a very old or established.
Absolutely, it had been recently established, actually established 1968. So 5 years after before I joined, it had been established. And it was good because it had excellent staff, excellent lecturers, assistant professors, professors. And these were all in some way associated with Abdus Salam. Either they were his
This is
students.
Pakistan's Nobel Prize winning physicist.
That's right.
Yeah.
Either they worked directly with him or they were inspired by him. And most of them were from Imperial College, London. Now, these were people who were then creating students, and then those students went out, and some of them did very well for themselves. But then something happened. Two things, I think. One was that in 1973 there was the Israel-Arab War,
The first Arab-Israeli war,
as a consequence of which there was an oil embargo. The oil embargo made wages in the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia very attractive, and so some of our best people started leaving because of that. But
And also the Gulf states were beginning their own university expansion, so they needed staff, presumably.
I don't know if there was something substantial then. Later on, certainly. But whatever there was over there, the Pakistani faculty was being attracted towards that. But there was another thing. There was a push factor because the university administration at Islamabad University now was not looking at merit alone. They were looking at political advantages. They were putting their favorites over there. They wanted control of departments in every form. So
this was the administration of the democratically elected Prime Minister Bhutto.
yeah, certainly he was democratically elected. I don't deny that he was democratically elected, but is democracy the panacea for all ills in a country where there is insufficient regard for basic values such as honesty? What happened was that Bhutto favorites got propelled into high positions. You saw that in the case of the bureaucracy, where what was called lateral entry was allowed. So instead of them making their way up through the civil service examinations, they could just get in there because Mr. Bhutto or one of his acolytes wanted a particular person there. One dreadful mistake that Mr. Bhutto made was to put his ultimate nemesis, Ziaul Haq,
General Zia, the head of the army.
the head of the army, who was a low-down person in the army hierarchy. He picked him up and he put him at the very top. And this is the man who hanged him eventually.
But I think just going back to that kind of dichotomy, or that, so if you not quite dichotomy with that paradox, that if if the democratically elected civilian leadership interfered with universities, with autonomy, with appointments, can you blame people who then say we want the army back?
Oh yes, of course I'll blame them. Because is the army an army of angels? By no means. They're just as corrupt, worse. They can't be touched. At least you can shout against civilians when they do such a thing, not against the army.
So speaking of which, I mean, again, looking at the book that you've written, you also talk about the present. And, right now we are in a situation clearly where the hold of what you call the security establishment is perhaps much more visible than it might have been in more recent years. Where do you see that in relation to universities and science? Much?
I actually don't see a relationship between the two. The army is interested in exercising its political control, its control on everything that it wants. It wants control of businesses, of banks, of airlines, of what are called the DHAs, the defense housing authorities. It wants everything that has to do with money, and it wants control. But it's not particularly concerned about the quality of education in Pakistani schools, colleges, or universities. That, if it's there, it's there. It's not the army's problem. That's a civilian authority's problem.
But presumably, though, but for the military to retain its influence and to expand its influence the way you're describing, it needs competent people, and competent people will come from a competent education system, surely.
That's an excellent point. If there was realization to that extent, we would have been spared so much pain. The hope now, and now you're quite right that a modern army requires people who have modern skills. What they hope for is that there is a sufficient number of such people hanging around, if not in Pakistan, then outside, and so they welcome dual nationals from the United Kingdom or US or whatever to be there temporarily and get things fixed, and then if eventually go back. Now, the problem is it doesn't work. What you need in order to have a modern army, air force, navy, just the defense part, forget everything else, is lots of technically skilled people. But you can't get technically skilled people if they don't know how to properly read, write, and do basic math. And so eventually, I'd say that the establishment is shooting itself in the foot by insisting that our kids in Pakistan have so much religion and ideology needed into their education. In fact, it's stuffed with it. By doing so, they're actually, as I said, shooting themselves in the foot. Because if a kid spends half his time reading stuff that he has no clue about in Arabic, or even in Urdu, I mean, what's the relevance of something from centuries past? Well, then they're not going to learn the level of math, science, other skills that are needed for the modern age.
So speaking of which, we can sort of come on to a related topic. In fact, you've presaged it yourself, and that is that you're deeply embedded as a critical thinker, but in a very small c conservative environment where lots of people are extremely devout, and that's not to say that you're not in that category yourself, but clearly when you write, you're a visible public intellectual, and you question a lot of what I might call sacred cows, or Aunt Sally's, as they would say. Again, looking at the span of time that you've been a public figure, how has the reception been to the things that you've been saying? For example, just now, just being skeptical or critical of very old ideas or received wisdom, that kind of thing.
Not friendly.
But has there been a change over time, or has it always been the same?
Actually, you asked me a very difficult question, because I prefer not to look at the social media, which is the major means by which people exchange opinion. But I hear from people that a lot of nasty things are said about me. It's okay, let them. I don't let myself be bothered by that. The point is that we have to be able to speak our minds. We have to have reason and rationality be the reason, rationality, and humanity be our guides for action in every sphere of our lives, and particularly when it comes to educating young people. Now, I know that gets people very angry, and they would prefer that they would educate their children the way they do, which means that with a huge excess of religious materials. But I think that in the end, it is simply clubbing yourself in the foot.
So in terms of, I mean, you've got a very well-stated public position, and, those who are in authority, they understand your position. Over time, have you been able to bring more people to your way of thinking? Do you feel like, I don't want to talk about winning and losing, but do you feel like your influence is gaining ground?
I simply cannot answer that question. All I know is that there are lots of people. I wouldn't say they're the majority by any means, but I'd say they're at least 15% of the educated people in Punjab, and much more in Baluchistan, in Sindh, and Gilgit-Baltistan.
Which are the northern parts?
Well, they're different parts. I'm saying nothing about Khyber KPK or NWFP. Okay, that's a very conservative area. But
which is the part that borders Afghanistan.
Exactly, where where the influence of the Taliban is very palpable as well. Now, I
mean, when you step outside, I don't know, off a bus or a train or a car, do you get recognized in the street, for example?
Yes.
And what sort of reaction do you get?
The reaction I get is always friendly, because presumably the ones who are unfriendly would prefer to ignore me or don't know me, whatever. But yeah, the people who do recognize me are friendly.
I mean, I do remember a time when I spoke to you. It's a while ago now, when you were at Quaid-e-Azam University, and I had we can probably, if you want, you don't want to have to record this, but basically, we were. I brought a crew from the BBC, and we were filming. We were doing a documentary, and we couldn't move for your fans. I mean, they were just literally following you everywhere.
Okay, they could be just curious, but it's possible because.
Well, no. We interviewed them afterwards, because we went in there thinking that you're a controversial figure, and everyone's going to go, this Professor HOODBHOY is basically sending us off the wrong path, onto the wrong path, or sending us astray. But all we got was just, I mean, you're clearly a very popular lecturer, teacher.
This is exactly why I've been banned from the majority of campuses in Pakistan. They think I'm an evil influence on students.
So when you say banned, what does that mean?
That means that I get invited by student groups, and in a matter of hours, perhaps after a couple of days, that invitation is rescinded.
By the university administration?
They don't say, sorry, circumstances are such that we cannot invite you, and we apologize.
Which means they've had a phone call or a communication from somewhere.
Yes, absolutely. And this is also what makes a lot of them very cautious about inviting me.
And so, who is the next Professor HOODBHOY?
Oh, I think
the space for free-thinking public intellectuals.
Of that, there are plenty.
There are plenty. Are you confident?
Yes, I'm confident, and I'm also confident that the means of expression they have are absolutely brilliant. You see how innovative they are.
How are they brilliant?
In terms of the kind of cartoons they make, caricatures that they make, how they can, what do you say, meme people, mime people, yeah. So that, in terms of their communication ability, and now there are lots of these, what do you call them, bloggers, not bloggers, but those who have their own shows. Influencers, public influencers. Lots of them. I'm happy about them, thrilled about it.
So Professor HOODBHOY, nuclear physicist, what's the state of the field in Pakistan? And I mean that in a sense from the work that's being done by the Atomic Energy Commission's organizations through to the public system?
I think...
And we're talking about just the field in general.
Okay, so let's look at the field in general. I don't think nuclear physics is the field that was the hottest around, the way it was in the 1960s. Particle physics took over, then particle physics and string theory. Then you had the merging of all that into cosmology, and now Big Bang cosmology. We talk about strings being there at the very beginning, and all the stuff about black holes and entropy of black holes and so forth. Now it's gotten much more multidisciplinary. Of course, nuclear physics is still interesting. Discovery of super heavy elements, of rapidly spinning nuclei, all that stuff. But it's not cutting edge stuff, and the sort of thing that I did for my PhD, I don't think would get me a PhD today. Might not.
Would you say that, I mean, one of the things that we hear a lot from today's early career scientists or researchers is that they can't feel that they're making a contribution because of data, that there is so much data in a field that it's difficult, it's difficult for them to feel that they're actually contributing. Because they
that is different from field to field. Now, look, there is a lot of, let's take astronomy, or rather cosmology. Now, there's stuff that we can listen to at every frequency range. Then there's the James Webb Space Telescope and all that. So there is a lot of data over there, and if you're tuned to a particular range of things, like, for example, such an interesting idea. Suppose that there are stars made of dark matter. Sounds pretty impossible. Yes, it's possible. Well, how might you discover them? Well, what if you have two such black holes going around each other and they collide with each other? Then out come the gravitational waves. And the kind of signature that will be there, maybe it's already there in the stuff that we're hearing. So there's lots of data, too much data, true. Other places, so little data, so few ideas.
For example?
Look at where superstring theory has ended up. It is Did
you think it would end up there, where it is now, which is?
That's for the very top level experts like Witten to decide upon, because I'm too low a life on that scale. But I did use some of their ideas for, in nuclear physics. That's a...
There's a, again, we can probably cut this out, but there's a YouTube video of a very young Ed Witten with Salam and a couple of other physicists. You've probably seen it. It's the body language, even if you don't follow the science, the body language is fascinating.
It's fascinating because you see Ed Witten in control, Salam listening on intently, and there was Budini, yes,
Budini,
who was listening on. Yes,
they must have done it in Trieste, I'm imagining.
Yeah, of course it's in Trieste.
Yeah. So, did you publish with Professor Salam?
Well, we not a scientific paper. We wrote the foreword to a book, a rather long foreword to a book on the development of science in third world countries, and this was 1986 that Salam asked me to write this foreword. It was actually by John Zeeman, the god of solid state physics, and Michael Moravcik. They'd written this book, and Salam said, why don't you write the preface? I said, heavens, Professor Salam, where are you and where am I, and who would ever look at a preface that's written by me? So he said, okay, I understand that, so you write it and I'll fix it. So I wrote it and he fixed it, and that's the only paper that I've written with Salam.
Did you find it at all paradoxical that Salam was such a devout man? I mean, he took his religion deadly seriously, didn't he?
Yeah, and I didn't think he would write the preface to my book on Islam and science. I sent it to him expecting that he'd say, forget it, I'm not even getting near to this stuff. But he wrote, and he said his very first words over there, when Professor HOODBHOY asked me to write the preface, he said, I don't think you will write it. He says, I looked at the book, I read through it, and I found nothing that was wrong or anything that needed correction, except that he hasn't pointed out exactly how science can be brought back into Islam. And then he has his own set of points in the preface.
And just really, it's sad, to be honest, that he is not a name that you often see or read about in Pakistani academic institutions. Do you think that could ever change?
Not in my lifetime, not in the foreseeable future, but how far can I see the future? I hope it'll change after that.
So Professor HOODBHOY, these days you're you're less of a working researcher, you're still an educator, and of course you're a very distinguished broadcaster and popularizer. What are you doing? What are your pursuits right now?
My effort is to create, has gone towards creating a public space in Islamabad for science, art, culture. It's open to all. It is free for all. And basically we have 4 or 5 activities. One is that every evening there's a lecture on something that's interesting, whether that's a discovery made by the James Webb Space Telescope, or interpretation of quantum mechanics, or some part of history that was uncovered by someone that is not generally known, etc. That's one part. Another part is that we seek to enthuse children into science, and we do that by not lecturing them, well, we do to an extent, but by getting them to play with science toys. And so we have a little laboratory in the black hole which has a lot of toys, some of which are donated to us, others that we make ourselves, others that kids make for themselves, and they learn basic physical principles. We've also recently started a workshop, a teacher's training program for math and physics. It's absolutely appalling how little math and physics our teachers know. So we're looking at something like grade 10 and grade 11, 12. And even at that level, our professors would not be able to solve problems. It's bad beyond words. So what we've done is we've now selected the best high school teachers who are willing to train with us. We are paying them 10,000 rupees per module, 4 modules a week, and this for a year, to learn physics and math properly so that they can teach classes at that level properly. That's another thing. Then we go to schools around in the area, and we go to different cities in order to enthuse kids into science. But that's that part. Generally, what we seek to do at the black hole is to liberate the mind. Look, you cannot do science, and science by itself is not everything. What one needs is free thought. If you chain thought, your society then is chained. And so, while seeking not to offend anyone, we push the boundaries as far as we can.
And what sort of reaction do you get when you do push the boundary?
So far, we have had no negative reactions from the powers up above. We have expressed, articulated opinions. And when I say we, it doesn't mean that it's a group of 10 people or 5 or 20 people. No. Anyone who comes along and has written or has expressed a point of view which we think needs to be heard, whether that be on history, whether that be on current issues like the economic meltdown, we give them space to speak. We also have theatre groups who come and perform over there. We have film screenings, book launches, and the degree of activity is such that it's not rivaled by any other place in Pakistan. We have sometimes one event an evening, sometimes two an evening, and the mornings are filled up with kids coming in from schools. So in this very little amount of space that we have, I don't think we could pack more content than has been done anywhere.
Great. Professor HOODBHOY, thank you so much.
Thanks.